Hi, everyone. I'm Clarissa Sorensen-Unruh, and I'm here with Maha Bali, and she is going to talk about social justice, decolonization, and equity for us today, our theme for the day. All right, so our first question is, do you want to introduce yourself a bit, Maha?
Sure. So I'm Maha. I'm an associate professor of practice at the Center for Learning and Teaching at the American University in Cairo in Egypt. And I'm also the co-founder of Virtually Connecting and Equity Unbound. So Virtually Connecting is a grassroots movement to bring access, originally to bring access to conferences for people who couldn't make it, but also now sort of against all the gatekeeping that conferences does.
Mm-hmm.
And Equity Unbound is an open, connected learning curriculum that is equity-focused, an equity-focused way of teaching about digital literacy.
Cool.
And I'm the co-facilitator of that.
Maha does a lot, so I'm really glad that I let her introduce herself because I have no idea what to say. It would be a laundry list of things that she does. Okay. All right. So the first question we have for today is for folks who are new to these terms. Can you quickly define or operationalize or both social justice and equity?
All right, I'm going to start with equity because equity is I think, easier and smaller term. And I have a particular image that I like to use to discuss it. And Rissa, you can feel free to jump in and say something as I do at this point.
Okay.
You've seen it before so many times.
I love that. I love this image.
I hope it shows really well here because for me, as the person sharing the screen, I can't see where it says equality on the left and equity on the right.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd encourage people to look at this. They've probably seen a version of this where people were looking at a baseball field. And it's very funny because I never noticed it was a baseball field because I'm in Egypt and we don't play baseball. Okay. So I didn't know what they were looking at.
That's totally fair. I had never thought about that. I'm so sorry.
So this one, people are always like, why are you showing another one? We've seen that one before. And I'm like, this one is more culturally neutral.
Right.
Because most people have apples, but there are also countries where people don't eat apples. But anyway, it's like an agricultural version. And you can't, and some people were like, the other one has only white people, and then they made one with black people, but this one has colorful people. So.
Right. So it has some
even has
moments.
A left-handed person.
I know.
So that's cool. I'm left-handed. Cool. But when you look at it, to me, equality is obviously giving everyone the same thing. And anyone who has children knows that does not work because not all of your kids like the same kind of chocolate. Or my kid doesn't even like chocolate, right? So giving them all the same thing as a start is not good. It's not going to get them all to the same goal, but maybe you give them different levels of support for all of them to be able to reach that apple, right? And one of the things I see when I look at this one is also the middle person on the equality is jumping up and trying to reach. So maybe that's a kind of resilience. Whereas the yellow person is so far away, they're not even trying.
Right.
So I think that's important to keep in mind is just because one is shorter than the other doesn't mean they have no way of reaching it. Maybe they're resilient or they're resourceful and they would have found a way on their own. The other one is that you as the designer of an educational experience are making sure that everyone is able to reach the apple. But what gets on my nerves every time I see this is, what if someone doesn't want an apple? You're assuming everyone wants an apple. Like the equity equality thing is just making sure they can all reach the apple. But honestly, I think not everyone wants the apple. So when we do things like setting learning outcomes, you're assuming everyone wants to learn the same thing. Not only you're assuming they're all starting from the same point and will be able to reach the next point within a semester, but also assuming they all need to reach that same endpoint, which makes sense for some things, possibly in the sciences. I don't know, especially maybe the beginning courses, they want the same thing, but maybe they also want the same thing in a different way. So they want to learn experientially rather than theoretically, or vice versa. So that kind of thing I think is important. So for me, that's what equity is. And I think a lot of times people tend to use the two terms interchangeably, and that's problematic because it misses the details of that. Social justice is one of the terms I was telling Rissa before we went on the call that you read about and you hear about and you think you know what it means, and then you realize that it's much more complex than you thought. And the person who introduced me to the more complex version of it that I like to use a lot is Cheryl Hodgkinson Williams from University of Cape Town in South Africa. She was using that a model by Nancy Fraser. And the good thing about what Nancy Fraser does is a lot of times people think about social justice in two main ways. One is economic, and therefore the solution is to give access. So automatically that image of equity, equality, oh, the economic outcome you're looking for is the apple, and you give access to the apple. But that's not necessarily the only thing that can be wrong, right? So what Nancy Fraser says is social justice has three dimensions: economic, cultural, and political. Economic is obvious. The cultural is whose views are represented. So if you're assigning, for example, you're assigning stuff for people to read in Digital Pedagogy Lab, which views are represented? Are they all by white people? Are they all by women? Are they whose views? What minority views are represented in the readings that you're offering them? Things like that. And obviously your process, like your pedagogical process, can also be cultural. So for example, I'll give a very quick example. Like in Australia, when they have a lot of Chinese students, they're always complaining that Chinese students are not participating the same way as the Australian students. Well, obviously because you're not taking their culture into account and expecting them to assimilate without either modifying your pedagogy or at least preparing them for it. You know? Doing the equity thing. Maybe you believe the apple is the important thing, and that's not going to change sometimes. Sometimes you're not going to change it, but at least put them on. So that's the cultural. And the third one is the political, which is who gets to decide what's going to happen, who's designing the learning experience. And one of the most beautiful terminologies I learned from Nancy Fraser's work is parity of participation. And I should actually look for some table images for you, Carissa, because this helps describe this very well. And I'll do this in a minute. But I also want to try to talk about knowing that social justice has three dimensions. There are also levels of dealing with redressing injustice, right? So you can do a particular, first of all, it's contextual. So there might be a particular injustice in a particular context. And when you try to redress it, it might address a systemic injustice. Or it might only address it on the surface level. So for example, if it's an economic injustice and someone doesn't have access to a computer or a good internet connection, then you just give them a computer and a MiFi, right? But that's not systemic. That's just you're solving the problem for that person. Now that's called ameliorative. So you're just solving this problem now for this person. But what would be a better thing to do if you could on the reform level is to reform the infrastructure in that region, reduce the price of laptops for students or something like that that's more systemic, right? The other one is there could be something that is helpful for a group of people, but it can also be negative for another group of people or neutral for a certain group of people. So I'm thinking of what we do with virtually connecting. It requires a good internet connection to join a conversation. So if you don't have internet at all, this is just one more space that you're excluded from. It's not really including you. All right. And then the other aspect is that it might be neutral for some people. So people who regularly go to conferences and they join virtually connecting, there isn't any social justice happening there. It's just a good social experience for them, which is not bad. It's just not addressing social justice for them. It's addressing social justice for some people. And that's okay. It's just that we need to be aware of every intervention that we make, that it might have ameliorative, transformative, that's the systemic, but it can also be negative or neutral. And I know that you're sharing a paper by Rajiv, Catherine, and myself, where we apply this in I think that's tomorrow, probably, that you're sharing it with them. We'll see when you end up sharing with them. But we're applying it so that they can see it in practice and think about how do you think about these kinds of things. So let me share my screen to show you the inclusion aspect for the political aspect. So the political aspect is giving people parity of participation. Especially obviously in marginalized or oppressed groups, right? So here we go. This screen. This is just Nancy Fraser's model. If it helps people to just see it all.
Cool.
It helps them to be able to see that. It's very plain, but it's just clear.
It's very clear. Thank you. That's awesome.
And parity of participation, my favorite term. And so Shirley Chisholm, who I don't know if people know her, but she was maybe the first
Yeah.
African American woman to run for president, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Senate. Anyway, and so she said, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair.
Yeah, she was awesome.
Yeah, she was awesome, and that quote is awesome, but I'm looking at this table, and I'm asking you, would
Yeah.
you bring a folding chair to that table? How would that feel?
Yeah.
And that feels like second-class citizen.
Yeah, it does. It does.
And honestly, I am the kind of person, personally, who would bring the folding chair and force my way in, but most people wouldn't. And most oppressed people have internalized their own oppression to the extent where they can't imagine themselves in that space in the first place. They wouldn't even aspire to that, you know?
Right.
So they need to be invited differently.
Right.
I'm going to show a couple of other pictures and just think through this with you, is that this has more of a, like, you know, they're all misfits, so it's kind of easier to bring a chair, but they're
Right.
also facing forward and some of them are at the back.
Right.
This one feels kind of cool and equitable and relaxing, but they have something in common. They're
Right.
not exactly the same, but they have something in common.
Right.
So it feels like one of the key things about the word diversity and the way people celebrate diversity is actually really hard work.
Right.
So do this political social justice thing where you bring different people from different backgrounds and allow them to truly be able to make decisions about a learning environment or about a work environment or something like that. They might have very different views, so they wouldn't fit in the way these fit in, and it will make the process harder.
Right.
Because these are systemic issues and they will take time to fix, and they will have a very different perspective probably. Right. Than the regular dominant people in society.
Right.
And if they don't, then you've chosen the ones who have adapted really well.
Right. Right.
So if it's really, if it's not, and just the person who's that token person who actually just lets you listen to what you want to listen to, or they've internalized their oppression so much that they just behave like you. I would say, I don't want to get political, but you know, in the US, who those people would be.
Right. Right. Right.
And then let's take an analysis of this one where people are sitting and eating on the floor. Now, for whom is this an inclusive, equitable space, and for whom might it be a neutral or a negative place?
Right.
For people, first of all, it's a cultural thing. In some cultures, this is how they eat, and in some cultures, they don't.
Right.
For me, seeing, and even though this is actually from my part of the world, it's not my personal culture because I'm a city girl.
Sure.
So it looks weird to me, but I know people who live very close to where I live who would be eating that way. It's great for short people. It's great for children who don't have to sit up on a high chair and have to have this very special setup just to be able to eat with the adults.
Right.
It seems equitable, but I was doing this presentation recently, and in different cultures. So there's Iranian and Indian and Arab cultures who have this. And in one of them, they look like it, but it's hierarchical still. And in other ones, it's equitable. But I'm also thinking, I have rheumatoid arthritis, and I used to love sitting like this, but I can't anymore. My knees can't take it. And obviously elderly people or people with all kinds of bone issues wouldn't be able to do it. So it might sound good now, but not always. This is a campfire. A lot of people see this. What do you feel when you see this?
A lot of white people. There's a lot of white people around there.
I think there's a black guy at the left.
There's a token black guy, but there's a lot of white people. I like campfires. They make me think of like growing up, but I know people had problems with smoke. Like if you're an asthmatic, you have problems with smoke. If you don't like some people just really don't like their clothes to smell smoky. And some people are so far back, like this doesn't really show it, but if you're rows back, you can't feel the heat of the campfire.
Yes, someone was telling me that. So I realized after I've shown this so many times that I've never been in a campfire.
You're like, wait, I don't really get it.
Because people always talk about virtually connecting like a virtual campfire. And I was like, yeah, cool. What is a campfire? I've never been in a campfire. And this is like a storytelling. It's a very informal environment. It's a cool place where people who don't know each other can talk.
Right.
But I'm thinking that doesn't work for all people.
Well, this is old school too. This is very old school, right? Like this is like 70s or 80s. I think the lack of cell phones around that campfire now is
Okay.
something to be admired. That's not something that
Okay.
usually happens now.
Well, honestly, when I was looking at this picture recently with the COVID thing, I was sort of traumatized by how close they're
I
sitting
know.
together.
Like there's no 6 feet of distance or
But
2
before
meters.
that, I
Sorry.
used to talk about people who are autistic or borderline autistic,
Yeah.
for whom this kind of distance, or just people who don't like to be too close to, or even in my kind of culture where males and females shouldn't sit too close together.
Right. Right.
And my daughter, at a certain point in her life, she was afraid of fire so much that we couldn't light birthday candles.
Oh wow.
So, but
Okay.
definitely people who are asthmatic, I think that was a good point as well.
Yeah. Well, or have any kind of breathing issue.
Yeah.
If you had recently suffered from COVID, this would be not a great place to be.
Right. Right. I was actually with a friend of mine who was exactly that situation. She'd recently suffered from it, and she still had breathing.
Yeah.
Light breathing.
Yeah. This would be very problematic.
And this is a bar.
Which are
I
now
have
all
been
closed.
in so many. Yeah, I hope they stay closed. I mean, there was someone who's just tweeting about, a drunk person in the UK not doing social distancing. That's a surprise.
Yeah,
But I mean, they
I
could
was
be
gonna
drinking
say.
at home too. I guess people could drink at home. But this is the kind of space that people in Western cultures would usually describe as an informal, welcoming space of informal conversation with strangers even.
Right.
And every time this happens, it excludes a lot of people, including me, because I'm a practicing Muslim, but people who are recovering alcoholics who need to stay away from places like that.
Yeah.
Younger people, obviously.
Right.
All kinds of people who don't want to be in a place like that. And recently, I was in an online space where after we finished the formal part, they used to have something, I think it was called like a virtual pub or something.
Oh, yeah,
and
yeah.
So after doing it 3 or 4 times, I told them, you know what, actually, I emailed them privately. Well, I actually said it in the session, but I also emailed them privately and said, I've never attended this because of what you call it. And they changed it, and now it's called a virtual social.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was easy. In other spaces, people are like, you're being defensive, come and drink something else. And I was like, you don't get it. It's not about you drinking alcohol. It's about me being in a space where you're drinking.
Right.
And it's not that I'm trying to impose on you. I'm just telling you I'm not going to go there.
Right. Right. Right.
Anyway.
Right. No,
So
I think
those are
I always think of this as a alcoholic. If you're a recovering alcoholic, that's just like the wrong space for you. So I get.
And so for me, parity of participation is not to bring diverse people into an existing space with your rules and the table's already set, but to actually create space for them to contribute how they want that space to be built, how they want the rules to be, remove the table altogether, let them recreate the experience of how they want this to go. Awesome. Can you do that with your students? Is one question. And the second question is, can you do it so that the minority students have an equal voice? And this is really important because when you talk about power and the teacher stepping back, that does not remove power from the classroom, that just reduces the teacher's power.
Right.
But you put students in groups of 3 or 4.
Right.
It's still possible one of them will dominate either because of their social power or just their personality.
Right.
I mean, I'm a girl, but I have a very strong personality, so you can put me with 3 guys and I can dominate them. As long as they're not my husband.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
You know, so it's really important to think about all of these things. I hope the images were helpful.
Very.
I'm glad I have this stuff so that it's really easy for me to bring it up.
Awesome.
I think it's better than just me talking.
No, I think it's awesome, and it helps solidify the ideas. I think images speak 1,000 words, right? Okay. So the next question. How are these promoted and used in your classroom? So how do you promote and use social justice and equity in your classroom? And do you have examples?
I have examples.
Okay.
All right. So I'm going to step back and just explain something that I'm not sure all people are familiar with.
Sure.
There's something called curriculum theory.
Okay.
That a lot of educators don't know about for some reason.
Sure.
So there are different ways to design a curriculum. You can either design it by starting with the content, which a lot of people do. They get the textbook and they design a curriculum around it. You can design by starting with the outcomes, which a lot of higher education and accreditation asks us to do. Like start with the outcomes, backward design.
Right.
Those 2 methods have a problem with them, is that they assume that the choice of content and the choice of outcomes is neutral. and it doesn't actually help you as a teacher figure out what's going to happen in my classroom to be able to teach that content to
Right.
those outcomes. And it also doesn't allow you to respond to what students need.
Right.
Because what if your students, this content is not relevant to them? I teach at the American University in Cairo. We use a lot of American textbooks. And then they have baseball examples for maths. And people don't know the rules of baseball, so they don't understand what this is about.
Right.
And they stop at that, and then they can't solve the word problem.
Right.
And your point is you want them to be able to apply math to a real life problem that's explained not in mathematical notation.
Right.
But it's cultural, and you need to realize that.
Right.
So that's one example. Another example in science education specifically is gender.
Right.
If all the examples are cars and sports,
right.
and your society doesn't encourage girls, I mean, my daughter loves cars and she loves that, but if your society doesn't encourage it, she's not going to be put in lots of situations in her life where these are the things that she's talking about all the time. And so with all the examples, that's sort of telling people, oh, STEM is for boys.
Right.
That's why the examples are ones that will engage boys.
Right.
Not because sports and cars can't be for girls, but because society does.
Right.
So that's one of the things that's wrong with that. And also, the outcomes tend to be measurable, specific, and all that kind of thing, which a lot of really valuable things cannot be written down.
Right.
And then you have to rewrite them so that they fit, and then you have to make sure your assessments do it, and then you've lost sometimes a lot of the most valuable things in your class. Exactly. So there are actually two other ways of designing curriculum there are actually more than two, but I mean, these two are the two big ones, right?
Right.
One of them is a process-oriented curriculum.
Okay.
Where you focus on the process of teaching and learning in the classroom. And the teacher and the learners just together decide how the learning experience is going to be. And anyone who is a really good teacher already does that, but you're actually deviating from the outcomes and the content in order to respond to your students.
Right.
And maybe feeling guilty that, oh my God, we were supposed to cover 3 things today and we only covered 1 because we were talking about something else. So that you need to have very well-trained teachers who have that flexibility.
Right.
They have sort of Lego blocks and they put them in whatever order that needs to be done in the moment.
Right.
And you need to, as an institution, give a lot of autonomy to teachers.
Right.
So that they don't get penalized for doing it,
right?
Right. But also, as an institution, if you have courses that are prerequisites, it can become problematic.
Right.
If it's not the entire institution doing this.
Right.
So that's one.
Yeah.
But even with the process-oriented curriculum, obviously people who believe in outcomes have problems with it because it's too loose. Right. It's more difficult to measure and all that. It's not that it doesn't have outcomes. It's just that outcomes are not your starting point.
Right.
It's the principles of pedagogy and engagement that are your starting point.
Right.
And so when you're giving an example and you realize that the students are not getting it, you change. You change in the middle and you give a different example, as any good teacher would do.
Right.
But there are schools that tell the teacher you have 5 minutes to do this, 10 minutes to do that, and then you can deviate, right?
Oh,
we have some of those here. We have some of those here.
That's
more in K to 12 than college. I don't think it happens.
Okay.
But there is the like if you're doing a unified exam across sections,
right?
You do need to finish all the same content if everybody's having the same midterm. You sort of have those. Maybe not as directly, but they're there.
Right.
But the problem with process-oriented curriculum is that you don't remove the power and social justice issues by just doing it.
Right.
Because like I said earlier, which student gets to do this, and even the teacher themselves is probably a white middle-class person, or at least a middle-class person because they're a teacher.
Yep.
So that doesn't necessarily remove all the power. So the other approach gets inspired by Paulo Freire, and it's a critical curriculum of praxis where you're focusing on social justice. Now, Kornbluth took this one step further, and she called it a critical curriculum in context. So you're doing 2 things. And this is what I do in my class, and this is how I apply social justice in my class. Okay. The topics that you're talking about have a social justice orientation. Okay. And the way you manage your class within the class has a social justice orientation.
Yes.
But one of the tricky things in a lot of people who are scholars in social science and humanities is that they may be people who do research with a social justice perspective and they talk about it, but they don't embody it in their own practice in the way they treat people and in the way they treat their students when they have power. All right? Okay?
Ouch, fire.
And it's tricky because the more you talk about these things, so people like Jesse Stommel, Sean Michael Morris, myself,
Mm-hmm.
It's much easier to find us doing something wrong because we talk about it so much.
Right.
And idealistically speaking, but in practice, of course, you make mistakes all the time,
Well, yeah.
right?
Life is
But
experimental, though.
but do, it is, yeah, but you have to keep trying, and you have
Right.
to make mistakes, and you have to admit your mistakes,
Right.
and learn from them.
Right.
But you have to be trying to do it in the first place, and a lot of
Right.
people aren't doing it.
Right.
So you wanted examples from my class. I'm sorry it took me so long to get there.
No, that's awesome. I'm going to need
So
that article, by the way.
Which one of them?
The one with the one that is the way you teach.
Is that an article? Okay.
Or book or
We'll
reference,
find out.
whatever.
We'll
it
find
is.
out.
We'll figure
find
it out.
We'll talk about it later.
It's okay.
Okay.
You're botting
So
it in your class.
there's another one. There's another article I'm going to talk about now that's about the way I teach too. So.
Okay, fantastic.
There's so many of them. There's so many of them. All right. I write a lot. I'm very privileged that way.
I like that.
All right. So I teach a course on digital literacy.
Mm-hmm.
And I do this, it's a course that I designed myself. It's a core curriculum option, so part of the liberal arts requirement for students, but it's one option.
Okay.
And it's a digital literacies in an intercultural context.
Okay.
You could teach that course completely with any curriculum design. But
Sure.
I'm using this social justice background, right? My principles are all social justice.
Right.
And this is the same course that Equity Unbound also works with.
Oh.
So my course existed, and then I worked with 2 other people in the US and Ireland to design the Equity Unbound, and then we have more people joining us. And anyway, but here's the thing. So the first thing is what I said earlier, which is the content of your classroom is social justice focused. And
Mm-hmm.
the way I teach digital literacies and intercultural learning is to start teaching about identity and equity and empathy and bias and othering
Sure.
first, before we start talking about digital literacy altogether or intercultural learning. Because if you get into an intercultural learning experience, which my students do in this course, they have intercultural dialogue with folks in different parts of the country. It can be quite a colonizing experience because the people in the West are benefiting from that kind of dialogue in very different ways. The people in this part of the world, our part of the world has worse internet connections. Our part of the world are using English, which is not their first language. And even though my students are fluent, there are other participants who are not, who don't have a skill.
Right.
So it's already a very unjust social space.
Right.
The rules of engagement are with a Western version of what dialogue is.
Right.
The one that they participate in is one where the facilitators are very aware of power dynamics and they call them out and they try to address them. But if the students themselves are not aware,
right.
First of all, they might have just internalized the fact that, yeah, I have to speak English to be able to be understood and there's no other way, and they don't feel like there's anything wrong with it.
Right.
But they need to realize there is something wrong with that.
Right.
You know, if there's space A and B, you're jumping 9 steps and they're just jumping 9 steps.
Right. Right.
So it's fine that you jump the 9 steps because you can, but it's important to realize that you're doing a lot more work than they're doing.
Right.
To be able to have this dialogue. And you know their culture very well from pop culture, and they don't know your culture very well. And you're sort of explaining, you know how minorities have the burden of explaining themselves.
Right.
To have to say that you're an a Muslim person who's not a terrorist, that's a burden that you have to take in. Going in knowing that this is what people might be thinking of you, right? So it's
that makes
those are things. And then also for me, like digital literacies themselves, you can approach it with a very neutral lens, like, you know, this is what digital literacy is, and you just need to be critical to the use of technology. But also, I want to talk to them about Safiya Noble's work in algorithms of oppression and how algorithms, which we thought were neutral when you Google something, it actually isn't neutral. And we go through the processes of that. I show them this game on called Quick Draw. Have you ever seen it?
Yeah.
So the name is problematic, but anyway.
Right.
Quick Draw, right? But anyway. But I also let them play it several times in Arabic and in English. Mm-hmm. And the pictures are very cultural because the people who play them are mainly Western. And so they depict like angels in a particular way, whereas in the Islamic culture, you don't depict angels in pictorial form.
Right.
The hospital has to have a cross on it, even though over here it has a crescent. But the algorithm doesn't realize that because there's not enough Arabs or Muslims who are playing it. Or even me as a Muslim, I know what they're expecting, so I give them the cross so that I get the right answer, right?
Right.
So you're sort of internalizing that oppression rather than trying to fix the algorithm. I don't know if we played it often enough, if we could change that. That would be interesting.
I hope so.
Probably, but I don't know how often. Yeah, I don't know how often you'd have to play it together.
Yeah. Or how many people.
Yeah, and we talk about like digital redlining, so where institutions or governments intentionally give less access to certain people, and so reproducing inequality in that way. So if they hadn't learned about social justice to begin the class, then these parts of information justice, who has access to information, and what does it mean when there isn't transparency, you don't have access to information, how does it affect democracy, and things like that. And we talk about citizenship a little bit. So that's the content part. There's also who is the author of the content that I showed. So it's very important for me, as someone in an American university where most of the textbooks that get exposed to come from America, to not do. So first of all, very early in the course, we watched Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Danger of a Single Story. So she's a Nigerian author. Of course, obviously she's a well-known Nigerian author. It's much more difficult to find the ones that aren't well-known, but she's definitely someone worth knowing. I think students should know her. We read an article by Lina Munzir, who is a Lebanese writer who translates the work of Syrian refugee women. So we do that. And that really touches them because she talks about the active translation in the Arabic language and English language and the Syrian refugee situation. And so that touches them because it's closer to them. So it's culturally relevant pedagogy. You're getting the pedagogy from their culture. And a lot of that. So trying to make sure that a lot of my authors are people of color and people from the global south. Occasionally someone Egyptian, not always, but sometimes it makes sense. And I find someone Egyptian. But more than the content that I choose is giving them the option to bring in their own content. So first of all, we design digital narrative games. They play the games of other students from the past 4 or 5 semesters. So they've seen other Egyptians do this and other students do this, and they do really good work, and they see that, oh, I can do this too. I'm a producer, and not just a consumer of knowledge. And they also bring in their own content. And one semester, one student said, I want to know about more Egyptian digital literacy. And I said, cool, you guys bring an Egyptian person or organization or group that uses their digital literacy, like they're a YouTuber, they're an influencer on Instagram, they're on Twitter, and I've been curating that. And those are people now we look up to and look at them and how are they using their digital literacy. So we've had like anti-cancer groups and sexual harassment, anti-harassment group, and all kinds of things. And just sometimes it's just a person who has curly hair who talks about that, because people in my part of the world, a lot of them have curly hair. And that's the social justice issue, is that how women think about their own bodies, right? There are things like, and I think even because I don't have curly hair, this is not something I think about a lot, but they made me really think about it, right? So that. The other thing is also just my classroom process. So just how does the class students have choices over what they read or watch before they come to class. A lot of times it'll be, you can watch this or read this, they're similar, you choose. Or sometimes there are 2 articles and you can choose this one or that one. And sometimes I say, because sometimes occasionally I have students who have different levels of English proficiency, and I say, if you're comfortable, this is a good article for you to read, but if this is not comfortable, you have 2 other articles you can read instead. And then we come to class and we discuss them. So sometimes they're not identical, they're all gonna get discussed, but I want students who are able to go ahead and do the harder reading, but I try as much as possible to find the simplest possible reading for the point that I want to get across. Because rigor is not about making them work hard to learn, it's about the concept and discussing them and engaging with them. So if it's too difficult to understand, then we're not going to engage with them. And also they blog their reflections usually about something, or they put hypothesis annotations before they come to class. And that's what directs what I'm going to focus on in the class. So I don't decide from the reading what I'm going to focus on, they decide. And I bring that up. So the ones who are shy to bring it up, I'll bring up what they've written, and then the rest of us will talk about it. And students have always said in my class, they feel like they have the agency to sort of have control over what's going to happen. And because it's based on what they've written before, there's a little bit of a democracy versus if you just let them speak in the moment, because in the moment, some of them will speak and some of them won't. But because they've already blogged about it, they've already thought about it, they've had a chance to write about it, I can bring in a shy student's ideas, and they can be the ideas that we discuss in class, even though that person wouldn't have said it.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and I try to be flexible in all kinds of ways. So with COVID-19, for example, hit, I would say I understand that some of you have circumstances where you can't come to synchronous sessions, but others are having trouble managing their time, and so asynchronous is not working for them. So I would have a session where I meet them, but if you can't make it, this is what you can do instead.
Yeah.
And they're both equally okay.
Yeah.
When we were about to do a project and COVID-19 was there, I said, you could change your topic to focus on something COVID related or not.
Sure.
And some people wanted to do that. They felt like that was what they needed to do in the moment. And then there are others that are like, I'm sick of COVID, let me do something else. And
right.
That's important to think about how those things might mean different things.
Yeah.
I think I talked too much.
I liked it.
And I do ungrading, of course.
Ungrading is awesome. We're going to talk about ungrading further in the week.
Yeah, I'll let you do that.
I have a lot.
But I will mention Munir Fesha. I will mention Munir Fesha, who's a mathematician. He's a Palestinian who did his PhD in Harvard. Who's a mathematician, and he's one of the people we read when we're doing ungrading before they give themselves grades. And he says grading a human being is degrading. And I love how he talks about how grading is a bad use of mathematics. And again, how it's unjust, really, in all the ways that it's inequitable, all of those other things. And so,
it feels wrong. It just feels wrong.
That's why we all hate doing it. I mean, there's a reason. Like, if you could have a good feeling while you're doing something, there's probably something.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so do we need to unpack the term decolonization more? I think we've kind of unpacked it. I mean, if you want to unpack it some more, that'd be great. And do you think this should be used in higher ed? Like when and where should it be used?
So I'm very wary of ever defining this term. And I was just telling you that for me, I know what it feels like to be a person from a previously colonized country and to live with neo-colonialism. So even though colonialism is over, the remnants of it still touch us every day. And what I was telling you today is, in people from my part of the world feeling like they need to be educated in Western ways in order to be properly educated, in order to get a good job here, you need to speak English, and all of those things, these are living with us. And how we perceive ourselves as less, like we have to collaborate with Western others in order to get grants sometimes. And I think the way the grants get set and the way they ask you to write them often privilege people from certain backgrounds. I think one of the let me just say this one. I think epistemic listening, and this is a cultural injustice, right? Epistemic listening is a really important thing because a lot of the epistemologies that we have to follow in academia come from the West. And so when you try to do something in a different way because of your cultural background, it's not considered to be good enough, right? It's not considered scientific evidence. So
or scholarly.
Back to Munir Fesha, the mathematician, when he was doing his PhD, he went and told them, there are two references that I want to use, my mom and the Palestinian chicken. And they were like, those are not academic references. And think about, in smaller ways, I think we're starting to dissent from that in, for example, education technology, is that you can sometimes quote a blog or quote a Twitter thread. And the reason this is important is because minorities and women and indigenous people and so on may not be able to express their academic knowledge in traditional ways, like in books and articles. But they may be doing this. And if you want to listen to them, don't go straight to books where you will find Ruha Benjamin, Safiya Noble, Bell Hooks, but you won't find everyone. So, like someone like Chris Gilliard. He doesn't even write a lot, but he tweets a lot. He does write a little bit, but he tweets a lot more. And if you follow him, you're going to get a lot. If you wait until the book, you're going to miss out on this whole person, right? And so those things are really, really important. And thinking about places like Wikipedia, that's a space of supposedly democratic because anyone can edit it, but who can? It used to be very difficult to edit. It's easier now. But still, most of the editors who go and revise stuff are white men. And there's a lot of gender issues there, and there's a lot of cultural issues there. So one clear example of this is the story of the 1973 war between Egypt and Israel. The Arabic story is different than the English story.
I can imagine.
It uses the same facts. But in one of them, Israel won, and one of them, Egypt won.
Really?
It's an amazing story. We have a bridge and a city named for that date in Egypt, because to us it's a victory, but to
Wow.
Israel it's a victory. It's a political victory for Israel,
Wow.
but it's a military gain for Egypt. But for us, it's a military gain, and full stop. For them, it's no. Eventually, they feel like it's
Wow.
amazing.
That is crazy. Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
So, but that's what I mean. So, epistemic listening is in the sense that when you're trying to listen to someone whose culture is different and colonized or from a previously colonized space, it takes a lot of, you need to really listen very closely to be able to understand where they're coming from, and not to fit what they're telling you into your pre-existing schemas.
Right.
Because I've seen myself talk with white men sometimes where they keep not understanding what I'm trying to tell them.
Right.
And it takes a really long time for them to really understand what I'm telling them.
Right.
And then I also see people cite me without engaging with my ideas.
Right.
The decolonization it's a problematic term to use if you're not really decolonizing. Like if you're talking about just restructuring or critical or social justice, you don't need to call it decolonizing if that's not what you're doing.
Right.
It's really unfair to the term to use it that. Like you can be anti-racist and not decolonial. That's kind of
right.
They're two different things. They're related, but they're different.
Right.
And I mean, obviously, slavery and colonization were happening around the same time. But
right.
I don't experience racism in that way.
Right.
But I experience the after effects of colonization and neocolonialism. So coming from the U.S., the U.S. never colonized Egypt, but intellectually, culturally, imperialism.
Right.
And so when I try to think about that kind of thing, there are ways of doing it in small ways. And I think you need to just go back to your purpose and your principles and figure out if they connect with this, and then what you can actually apply in practice. So there's this space of your own classroom, I think, and at that level, I think a lot of us can try to decolonize. In a lot of the ways that I've already talked about, I have an article about my feminist approach to teaching digital literacies as a post-colonial, in this post-colonial context. So
okay, I will put it. That would be awesome, because that would be great. I'm going to have not only readings, but also extension.
Yes, exactly, extension. And then the other, but the other aspect of like decolonizing the entire institution is a much bigger project, and you might end up with no universities in the end.
Right.
And I wouldn't suggest that, because the whole deschooling discourse is problematic, because people who don't have educated parents cannot homeschool them. I don't know why people don't realize that.
Right.
Of course, you could also say that maybe these kids whose parents work in agriculture just need to learn agriculture, which is important, and it should not be excluded.
Right.
But maybe that person has potential to be a scientist, and by not educating them in the more traditional ways, you're not giving them that opportunity.
Right.
And so everyone has tried homeschooling now.
Right.
We all know that we're not all cut out for it, and we're educated people.
Yes.
It needs someone, first of all, people who are of socioeconomic backgrounds who need to work a lot won't be able to do it. They might not be educated enough to help their kids with math or whatever.
Right.
They might have lots of kids and not enough devices. So they're all, so sort of dismantling the institutions is maybe not the best thing you want to do. I know in South Africa, they tried to decolonize the way they were treating HIV, and I think they messed up big time. I don't know, I hope I'm getting this story right, but I think they tried to use traditional medicine to treat HIV, and it didn't work, and it backfired. So it's not always the right choice. I understand the need to try it, but maybe not when it's very high risk thing.
Right. No, I think that's fair. Because there was a huge stigma about HIV, right? So they didn't address the stigma; they just addressed the medical piece. Wasn't that part of it?
But I also think they didn't solve. They weren't treating the medical piece. And
right.
So it just grew.
Okay.
When they could have slowed it down. Or
sure.
I think that was the issue.
It's probably going to be how people look at COVID in the U.S.
Yeah, U.S. is very interesting because you're supposed to be like the richest, most educated country, but people don't believe it. No. I'm so sorry.
No.
You have to be. Because I mean, when it happens to us, we're a poor country. We're not really that educated. So when something stupid happens, it's fine.
There's no room for failure. Is that what you're saying? That's fair. That's fair.
Oh, and it's also bad because people look up to the US. And
Yeah.
it's okay.
I know.
I'm
Well,
sorry.
we don't
I've
have
been
the
talking
greatest
badly
leadership
about
right
Donald
now.
Trump since, yeah.
You know what? Who doesn't really at this point?
I apologize if someone is a Trump supporter. I mean, I don't
Okay.
really apologize, but I don't mean to offend them.
Yeah, it would be really interesting if they came to the DPL. So the last thought I had was, how do you break this? I mean, I could think of one way of breaking it.
What's the thing you're thinking about?
Well, I
Something
was
you
thinking
want-
about
break it.
your analogy about using the sources and using decolonization appropriately. And all I could think about was the full frontal video that I've just been looking at that was about Columbus Day that Deb Haaland is on. Deb Haaland is my representative in the US House of Representatives. And
What did she do?
and they were like, at the beginning, they're like, Christopher Columbus came and educated the new world, enlightened the new world. And she's like, no, and they were like, he's like a dude bro who came and just kind of fell upon this. And she's like, no. And finally they get through this whole moment where everyone realizes he was a genocidal maniac and a monster, like just a horrible, horrible human being in every way, shape, or form. And the actor who was like hired to play him was like, I can't do this anymore. The director's like, I thought you knew that he was a genocidal maniac. He's like, he's a monster. I was raised white. I had no idea. So I think that, when you're talking about colonization, I'm like, some of these stories that we have, even about colonization, are just entirely wrong, depending on how you were raised.
I'm almost ever afraid to tell someone Happy Thanksgiving or something. I'm not sure what the story there is.
It's like, was that a good story? Is that a bad story? I don't know. It's such a bad story. It's a bad story.
Anymore.
It's a bad story. Basically, from the indigenous point of view, what I've understood is that it's
so somebody's giving thanks, but not everyone's giving thanks.
Yeah, there's a lot of moments there. But anyway, so how do we screw up doing social justice in the classroom?
How do you screw up doing social justice? That's not what you're asking, right? How do we break the system so that we can do
how do you
social justice?
break? Well, you could talk about breaking the systems, but I'm saying more as if you were doing wrong theory on it. Like, how do we make it so that it's the least equitable kind of moment?
Do you know what you should
go wrong with this on a regular basis?
Do you know what you should do, Rissa?
What's that?
There's a liberating structure. You're gonna get so sick of me talking about this. There's a liberating structure called TRIZ. Okay, it's called TRIZ.
Okay.
And what you do is, as a group, you just divide people into small groups, and you can do it asynchronously as well.
Yeah.
But it's cool when it's done synchronously. Is that you tell people to sit together and think about the least equitable possible outcome.
Yeah.
You've done this before, right?
Yeah, it's called wrong theory. I did it, and it was called wrong theory, but it's the same thing.
Yeah, you start with the worst thing, and then you look at what it is you do from the worst thing, and then you go backwards until you decide what actions are you going to take against the wrong thing.
Yeah, I actually never screw it up enough. I'm never wrong enough.
I think, honestly, going back to Paulo Freire and the praxis concept, which is action with reflection, I think the worst thing you can do is take action without reflection. I think some of the people who screwed this up really well are Egyptians in 2011, where they took to the streets and they protested, and everyone was so impressed.
Right.
But they knew how to destroy a regime.
Yeah.
They didn't know how to work together to construct a regime. And so one of the things I talk about my feminist approach to teaching, which I did not talk about, but it's worth talking about now, is that critical thinking, as usually conceived in the North American context, is about skepticism.
Yeah.
And argument.
It is.
And this is quite anti-feminist and anti-minority, who sometimes want to, and also when you hear something that is so cognitively dissonant or different from what you're used to, and you're used to being skeptical, you're not going to listen properly to this new idea that you've never heard before. And then you're going to just keep the same beliefs that you have because it's so easy to resist because you're so critical.
Right.
And so this is one of the ways you mess it up, is by teaching critical thinking the wrong way.
Ooh.
Where skepticism, so that Mike Caulfield actually noticed this happening, and I told him, of course it's happening.
Yeah.
when you teach about digital literacy, and then they don't believe, of course, the false sources, but they also don't believe the experts and they don't believe the credible sources. They just
Right.
become skeptical.
Right.
So they've turned from black and white to white and black. It's not really not helpful.
Right. Right.
Right. So, but when you have a
bad.
more feminist approach to this, where you sort of try to understand the other first before you question,
Yes.
and trying to work together to construct something rather than just destroy something.
Yes.
That is something that's in this book called Women's Ways of Knowing, that I learned about, that really transformed a lot of my thinking about just how you do dialogue in the classroom. Whenever people talk about, we're going to do a debate, it's like, why? Why do you do a debate? Why do you want people to pit people against each other?
Right.
And to make them think that it's what's it called? Binaries, when they're not binaries, and we know they're not binaries, and we don't want them to think that way.
Right.
It's a spectrum. We know it's a spectrum. Talk about it as a spectrum. Perhaps talk about it from multiple points of view.
Sure.
Like, give people different roles to talk about the topic.
Right.
Because people with different roles will have different perspectives, and they need to know that,
right,
rather than debate it in this fake way of representing reality. So I think a lot of times it's the doing critical thinking wrong that can mess this whole thing up. Thinking about how minority voices can be, here's another way you can mess it up. You can mess it up when you're trying to discuss different viewpoints, and the dominant is one of them.
Right.
Because when the dominant view is among the views equally, you give it equal time, it's not an equitable space, because the dominant view is everybody's already internalized it.
Right.
And so you're not giving space to the others, because you're making them equal to the others. You need to actually sometimes remove the dominant view and focus on the alternative. Of course, it's alternative to the dominant, which is not a good way of framing it.
Right.
But you need to give space to these others so that you can really talk about them in depth without the dominant sort of messing it up for you.
Right. Right.
I don't know if that was what you were asking for.
No, that was awesome. That was awesome. I'm going to end the video so that you could, we could call it